Hello, folks. How's everybody doing tonight? Good. I'm so glad to be here. I just really appreciate the invitation to come back and be with you. I think it wasn't last. Was it the year before last? Was it last year? Man, the years start going together in my mind. And yeah, how long have you been here? 16. Okay, so yeah, it could have been 2 years ago then. Okay, yeah, I'm sorting all that stuff out in my mind. But it is good to be back. I'm excited to be here and spend just a little bit of time with you. And we're going to be looking at, like James said, at the life of Joseph. Just one of my favorite characters in all of the Old Testament. And before we do that, one of the things I always like to do is just take a minute and ask God to bless us in our study. And so why don't we do that? Father, it truly is a joy to be here. We just really can't think of a more wonderful place to be than among your people, just declaring how magnificent you are, and to be able to open your word together and spend just a few minutes contemplating all these things that you brought to us through your Spirit. And Father, as we are going to spend a few moments tonight looking into your word, our prayer is that you will find in us open hearts, that we will be eager to draw insight and knowledge from your word, and that, Father, we will have a renewed determination to conform our lives to it. So it's in the name of Jesus we would ask you to bless us in these few moments of Bible study, and we say amen. Well, if you've got your Bibles, you'll want to open them to Genesis chapter 40. Genesis chapter 40 is where we're going to spend our time tonight as we check in on Joseph. As we get ready to do that, let me just introduce it this way. I want to introduce it by talking about victims and victimization. You know, we hear the word victim a whole lot in our culture. In fact, probably the word victim has been used more in the last generation than maybe any generation before. It just seems like so many people are grabbing that word and applying it in new, creative ways. I think about those who say, you know, they were victims of child abuse. Because, when you begin to dig into it, they were victimized by oppressive parents. They had parents who were pretty strict with their boundaries. And they had parents who would occasionally light them up, if you know what I mean. And when there was defiant rebellion or disobedience. Parents who set boundaries and enforced boundaries. Then you've got people who say, you know, I'm a victim of an oppressive management where I work. They apply that term victim because they're just so rough on us. I mean, what their expectations for us, we have to work overtime so much, and we're held to such rigorous standards. It's just really oppressive. And they use the word victim to describe themselves. You know, those kind of notions of victimhood, it's just absurd. You know that. It's political correctness run amok is what it is. You know, kids who've been raised by parents who don't let them rule the roost are not victims of child abuse. Kids whose parents don't let them have unconstrained liberties aren't victims of child abuse. They happen to be blessed with parents who care, is what it is. And people who have to work in a place where there's high standards, high expectations, and sometimes you've got to work overtime to get that project due. You're not a victim of some kind of sadistic, oppressive management. You just have to understand that you're working in the real world. And to run a business sometimes demands things like that. And so the word victim is used in so many really frivolous ways. It has been used in so many frivolous ways. It can be very easy to just kind of get jaded almost about that term. But we know that there are true victims. And we know what real victimization is. A true victim as you know, is someone who is on the receiving end of genuine, unjust treatment. It's someone who is on the receiving end of genuinely unfair treatment. And there are people who are on the receiving end of that kind of treatment every day. And we need to recognize that, and we need to be sensitive to them, and our hearts go out to them. And if there's anyone in Scripture who can really tell us what it's like to be on the receiving end of real, true, genuine, unjust, and unfair treatment, it is Joseph. I'm telling you, he was on the receiving end of it. First of all, it started with his family. You know, this is a Thursday night group, and so you know about the life of Joseph. I don't have to get into a lot of the details. You know about his brothers. You know how his brothers despised him. You know how their feelings toward him was really linked to their father's favoritism toward him. You know all about that dysfunctional family. You know all about that moment when he came and they had eyes that were just full of murder and they were just bent on killing him. And you know that instead of that, they decided to sell him to this slow-moving caravan of Midianite traders. You know that. And so here he is, a victim of truly unjust and unfair treatment by his brothers. And then he finds himself on that slave block down in Egypt. And he is bought by a man named Potiphar. You know about that. A very powerful man in Egypt. And you know that Joseph distinguished himself. You know he served Potiphar with honor, with deep integrity. And you know as a result of that, there came this gradual gift of more responsibility and more privilege. And you also know it wasn't long until this trumped-up rape charge is laid at his feet by Potiphar's wife. And then you know what happened. He suddenly finds himself in an Egyptian dungeon. And that's where we find Joseph now in chapter 40. So we find Joseph sitting in this dungeon. And that's the word he uses, by the way. If you look down in verse 15, we'll see this in a few minutes, where he's explaining his plight to these two cellmates of his, and we'll talk about them in just a second. And then he mentions the fact that they put me into this dungeon. And the word there that if we could look through the English, and we were reading out of the Hebrew Bible, which was what the book of Genesis and most of the Old Testament was originally written in, the literal word there that's translated dungeon in most of our English versions is actually the word pit or hole. He finds himself in a pit, in a hole. Probably part of a dry cistern. It was not uncommon for these vast dry cisterns to be used as prisons and cells. And so that's where he's at. And now with that in mind, let's take a look. Let's begin by looking at his cellmates as he's sitting in this Egyptian dungeon. If you look in verse 1 of chapter 40, it says, "Then it came about after these things, the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt." So we're introduced to his two cellmates. One's called the cupbearer. Now, if you've got the old King James translation, I think it says the butler. But it's the cupbearer, and you've got the baker. You've got the chief cupbearer, and you've got the chief baker. Now, who in the world were they? Well, we don't actually know a whole lot of details about the position of cupbearer and baker, but we do know some details. We do know, for instance, that the cupbearer was a very, very important part of the king's cabinet. We do know that he probably had oversight of all of the agricultural holdings of the Pharaoh, especially the vineyards. It was his role to oversee them, to make sure they were productive. Everything that came with the territory of managing large agricultural operation, that probably fell to this cupbearer. And as kind of an extension of that role, he was also probably responsible for everything that went to the Pharaoh's table. Any food that went there, any drink that went there, he was responsible. He was the buck stopped with him. He ensured that everything that went into the king's mouth was not only of the highest quality, but it was safe as well. In fact, many have speculated that one of the cupbearer's chief responsibility was to be that last line of defense. You know, if you're a king in those days, and if you're a pharaoh, you got to be on guard. I mean, you got to be on your toes, because there's always someone who would love to have your position. And you had all these cloak and dagger movements going around trying to vie for position. And it wasn't uncommon for people to poison rulers. And so probably the cupbearer was the one who would taste everything for the Pharaoh. And if it was poison, so long cupbearer. But that's not important. What's important is long live Pharaoh. And so as you can probably imagine when you think about that, it was a very, very close relationship between those two men. And it was a relationship in which there was a lot of trust. And there had to be a lot of trust. And so if that trust were ever broken, it could be disastrous. And then the second man is called the chief baker. Well, again, we don't know a whole lot about what his position entailed, but we do know that it was another important official in Pharaoh's cabinet. We do know that he had oversight over all of the food, that he was the one probably who had oversight of the actual preparation of the food. And so, again, there was a lot of responsibility there in dealing with the quality of the food, the safety of the food. Two very, very, very important positions. So what did they do? Well, we don't know. We don't know what they did, but it says they offended their Lord. And verse 2 says, he was furious. You know, it had to be something that had to do with food. I mean, that's what both roles really dealt with. They were interrelated jobs. You know, maybe it potentially could be something even trivial. Maybe the biscuits were just a little overdone and dry and hard one morning, and the Pharaoh just couldn't take it. Maybe the baker put a few too many peppers in the chili, and the cupbearer didn't warn the Pharaoh. We can just think about all kinds of things, from trivial things to major. And it could have been anywhere along that spectrum. But whatever it was, it obviously had to do with food, and it made him furious. In fact, he was so angry, he basically said, get these guys out of my sight and throw them in jail. And so that's where we find them. Look at verse 2. Pharaoh was furious with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. So he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard in the jail, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. The captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them, and they were in confinement for some time. And now the plot thickens. Look at verse 5. Then the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who were confined in jail, both had a dream the same night. Each man with his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. And so the text then tells us that the next morning Joseph comes in, and he notices they really look dejected. And so he asks them, what's wrong? And they said, well, we've had these dreams, and we don't know what they mean. And he says, oh, really? Tell me about it. And so the cupbearer went first, and the cupbearer said, well, there was this vine And the vine had, verse 10, the vine had 3 branches. And the branches were budding, and they were blossoming. And on those branches that were budding and blossoming, there were these great clusters of grapes. And so in the dream, the Pharaoh's cup, verse 11, the Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. And I took a cluster of grapes, and I squeezed those grapes into the Pharaoh's cup, and then I gave the cup to Pharaoh. What in the world does that mean? And so Joseph responds here in verse 12, and he says, oh, well, I'll tell you what it means. You see, the 3 branches are 3 days. And brother, have I got good news for you. What this means is that in 3 days, you are going to be restored to your position. 3 days. 72 hours, my man, and you're out of this dump. 72 hours. And then we see, look at verse 14. Joseph says, listen, would you keep me in mind when you get out of here? When all goes well with you, keep me in mind. Please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. And then what we have in verse 15 is he begins to explain a little about his own plight and his innocence. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. I was kidnapped. I was completely innocent, thrown into this dungeon. Here you really see the humanity of Joseph begin to come out. I mean, he's human and he knows how things work in real life. And how things work is sometimes it's about who you know. And the fact of the matter is, here's a person who has the ear of Pharaoh. And in 3 days, he's going to be right back there beside Pharaoh, serving Pharaoh in his official capacity. If there is anyone who could possibly intercede on my behalf, it's him. And so would you please remember me when you get out of here? Well, in verse 16, the chief baker is listening to it all. And he gets really excited because it was great news for the cupbearer. And so the baker says, oh, let me tell you about my dream now. And he says, in my dream, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. And then, in the top basket, there was all sorts of baked food for the pharaohs. And it was the weirdest thing. These birds were eating out of the baskets. Now, what in the world does my dream mean? And Joseph says, oh man, listen, ooh, I got really bad news. Your dream does not have a happy ending. In fact, what it means, the 3 baskets are 3 days, he says in verse 18. And here's what's going to happen. Now, as I read this and as I'm kind of transporting myself to that time and place and thinking about it and wondering, what would I say in that situation? If I knew what was going to happen and I had this relationship with God where He reveals to me the meanings of these dreams and I'm in Joseph's sandals and I'm listening to this, I'm going to try probably, I like to think that I would probably try to, be a little tactful. I'm not going to tell him everything's going to be okay because in 72 hours he's going to find out it's not going to be okay. But I'm going to say, listen, it's bad news. And I hate to tell you this. I really hate to tell you this. But it's the end. It's the end. 3 days. Joseph gets a little more specific. And so he says, within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a tree. And the birds will eat your flesh off you. Well, what we're told next in verse 20. The hours went by. The countdown began. And we come to day 3. And it says, came about on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all of his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants, and he restored the chief cupbearer to his office, and he put the cup into the Pharaoh's hand, and he hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Now, I can imagine when the time came and the officials came to get the cupbearer and to get the baker, and they're escorting him out of that cell. Can you imagine how Joseph was feeling? You know he was excited. You know he was. I mean, you know what he was thinking. He's thinking this is a God thing. God has brought all of this to take place. He's brought this close official of Pharaoh to my presence, and he has revealed to me, God has caused this dream to happen, and he's revealed to me the meaning of it, and I've asked him, remember me when you get out so that I can be sprung from this place. Now here they come. It's all happening just like Joseph said it would. You know he is excited about it. He just knows that any minute now the warden's going to come in, and the warden's going to say, you're free to go. He knows that's what's going to happen. Look at verse 23. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Joseph's hopes and dreams were just absolutely smashed. He was completely forgotten. There was no warden with an emancipation proclamation. And then look at the next verse, the first verse of verse 41. Now it happened at the end of 2 full years. 2 more years. 2 more years in that hole. 2 more long, miserable years. 2. Now I actually want to stop there. And I want to make some application. I want us to reflect on what we see here, because I really do believe that there are things from this brief episode in Joseph's life that are really applicable to us and can serve us well. And the first thing that I want you to think about, that I really believe that this episode demonstrates, is that injustices and unfair treatment occasionally happens to innocent people. Now let me say that again. One of the things that we learn as we're reading through this and as we're watching it all unfold is it's a reminder that unfair treatment and real injustice sometimes happens to innocent people. Joseph did not deserve to be sitting in a prison, but that's exactly where he found himself. And people often find themselves in situations that they really don't deserve. People often find themselves on the receiving end of treatment that they never deserved. You know, children and young people mistreat other children. It happens all the time. It breaks your heart. Some of it can be brutal mistreatment. I'm not talking about just physically brutal, but just emotionally brutal. Wives and husbands are sometimes abandoned. Sometimes wives are abused. Sometimes churches, sometimes preachers have mistreated churches. And sometimes churches have mistreated preachers. And we could just go on, and we could go on, and we can go on. Children are sometimes the victim of abuse. People are falsely accused and arrested in our culture and put in jail. It actually happens. Injustices and unfair treatment happen. And I say that not to say, okay, what can we do to prevent this? What can we do to prevent injustices and unfair treatment? The fact of the matter is, there's nothing you can do to prevent it. Now, there may be things that we can do to increase the odds in our favor, to protect our children, to protect our marriage. There's things that we can do. But you can never guarantee that you have something within your power that's going to ensure that you're never on the receiving end of unfair or unjust treatment. It just happens. I want you to hold your place there, and I want you to turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. Look at 1 Peter chapter 2. When you get there, I want you to look down at about verse 20. 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter says, "For what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God." I mean, don't miss that. If you do what is right, when you do what is right and suffer for it, there are just going to be times when you haven't done anything wrong and you find yourself on the receiving end of unfair treatment and unjust treatment. I can't tell you the number of times in almost a quarter of a century of ministry where people have come in to my office and they are looking for answers. What did I do to deserve this? Maybe some of you have asked that before because you've been on the receiving end of unfair and unjust treatment. Dan, can I ask you, what have I done? What have I done to be treated this way? What am I doing that makes my husband treat me that way? What am I doing that makes my wife treat me that way? What am I doing? What did I do that caused this to happen to my children? What did I do wrong? Sometimes the answer is maybe nothing. But sometimes people are under the impression, well, if you're on the receiving end of unfair and unjust treatment, there's always a cause to that. No, there's not always a cause to it. Sometimes there's a cause. Sometimes it's the result of bad choices that get you in a mess. But sometimes it's not. And I can't tell you the number of people who have just kind of looked surprised when I've said, well, maybe nothing. Maybe you didn't do anything wrong. The fact of the matter is, it's part of this broken, messed up world that we're confined to for now. Sometimes you're just going to be on the receiving end of agonizing treatment. And so I tell you that, and we see it here in Joseph's life. What did he do to deserve being thrown in prison? Nothing. What did he do to deserve to be sold to a caravan of Midianite slave traders? What did he do? Nothing. And so, when those things happen, I simply draw your attention to Joseph, and hopefully your mind will come to Joseph, and you will realize that you won't ask the question, well, what could I have done to prevent this? Maybe nothing. Maybe nothing. That's the first thing that I think we learn that's really relevant and applicable about this episode from the life of Joseph. Now, let me tell you a second thing that I think we find beautifully demonstrated here by Joseph, and that is he shows us what the proper response to unfair treatment ought to be. Let me say that again. He demonstrates for us how we should respond to unfair treatment. I'll tell you, unfair treatment is very, very hard to bear. Listen, you know that though. You know that. Because you're just as human as I am. You prick any of us in here, we all bleed red. We're as human, and it is hard to bear unfair and unjust treatment. Just that nature within us. We want to strike back. We want to get even. We want to defend ourselves. There's naturally a measure of pride that is going to be there. It is hard not to strike back. And yet what we find here demonstrated in Joseph's life is that there is no bitterness that you see here. There's no seething anger that's there. Did he ever get angry? Well, I think so. I think so. Let me change that. I know he did. Well, how can you be so sure of that? Because he's a human being. And he's just been falsely accused of rape and thrown into a dungeon. I promise you he didn't skip into the dungeon singing Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. I promise that. I promise there was anger. There was frustration. But you don't see it here. And the reason you don't see it here is I'm convinced he didn't let it just, he didn't feed it. He didn't feed the anger. And he didn't feed the resentment. He didn't feed the bitterness. He didn't let that animal grow within him. You know, we can go back to 1 Peter chapter 2. Let me just flip over there very quickly and remind you again as we read it this time through the lens of what we're talking about at this moment, of how we're to respond to ill treatment. Listen to the second half of verse 20 again. But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. That is exactly what Joseph embodies. He deals with it, and he deals with it with patience there. I want you to look at chapter 40 again. I want you to look down once more when he comes comes to the cupbearer and the baker after they've had their dream. So he comes up to him, and look down at verse 6. It says, he observed them, and behold, they were dejected. And he asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in confinement in his master's house, why are your faces so sad today? You know, I can't help but to say, wow, and smile just a little bit when I read that. Because Joseph had every right to say, what are you guys? What are you so sad about? And then as they would start to explain it, he'd go, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that sob story. You want to hear a sob? Let me tell you about my plight. You want a story? Let me tell you about my story. You think you were done wrong? Let me tell you about what happened to me. No, you guys have been sitting in here for a day. I've been sitting in here for a lot longer than that. And I'm mad. He doesn't do that. He actually is interested in them. He's actually interested in their well-being. He actually ministers to them. And the reason that he can minister to them is because he's got the right attitude. Even in the midst of suffering, he has that right attitude. He's still concerned about them. He's still extending to them mercy, despite the fact that the bottom of his life has fallen out. You know, there are those times when the bottom does fall out of life. And you've got really, when that happens like it did in Joseph's life, there's really a couple of options that you have when the bottom falls out. The first option that you have is you can become very disillusioned. You can become very disillusioned and embittered. Someone came and spent 2 hours in my office yesterday because someone that she loves dearly unexpectedly died. And in a very real sense, the bottom of her world fell out. And she said, my heart is shattered. I just want to know why. I want to know why. Why did God take them from me? And you could just sense as she continued to talk, there was creeping into her own thinking this disillusionment. We were faithful. We were what we were supposed to be. Why did this happen? And there's this disillusionment. That's when the bottom falls out of line. One choice that you have is just become disillusioned and become embittered. But let me warn you, that is a very, very slippery slope. Because when you become embittered and disillusioned and you just let that grow and you don't deal with it. I told her I'm so glad she came in. Because I'm glad we got to sit down and we got to deal with it together. And we got to deal with it from a Christian perspective. And she felt so much better when she left. But some people don't deal with it. And so they just let it grow. And they stop trusting anybody. And they just get mad at everybody. And eventually that anger and that lack of trust even goes over to God. And they're just completely disillusioned with God now. It is a very slippery slope when you choose to be disillusioned and embittered. Now, the second choice you have when the bottom falls out of life is you can do what Joseph did. And that is, you just keep trusting the Lord. And you just keep putting your hope in Him. You don't get preoccupied with bitterness. You don't get preoccupied with resentment. You don't get preoccupied with hostility. Are you going to be angry? Listen, if you're done wrong and there's not any anger, I would actually question your sanity. Honestly. That's natural. Somebody does you wrong. It's not terribly wrong if you're not angry about that. Listen, we have permission to get angry. I mean, Paul tells us that in Ephesians chapter 4 when he's helping us learn the nuts and bolts of Christian living. We can get angry, but he says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. What he's saying is simply this: don't nurse it. Don't nurse that anger and resentment, because if you nurse it, what he says there, you give Satan an opportunity. That Satan's going to step in and Satan's going to exploit that situation to the detriment of you and your soul and the church. But you can get angry, but don't nurse that anger. Anger's natural, but don't let it degenerate into sin. And so you can, instead of nursing your anger, becoming disillusioned and embittered, you can put your trust in God. You don't get preoccupied with bitterness and hostility and resentment. You don't nurse that. You ask God to help you deal with it. You ask God to help you overcome that bitterness. You ask Him to help you see through that dungeon and the darkness of that dungeon. And to deal with that dungeon, to take that dungeon experience and to use it to make you a better person. Those are your two choices, basically. Disillusionment and embitterment, or you keep trusting God. Now, I would say to you, look, if Joseph could keep his attitude and his heart right through these years of being in an Egyptian dungeon, then we can keep our attitude right when we face our dungeon experiences. Now, very quickly, the third thing that I think this episode demonstrates, and that is, it demonstrates that God is even there when the bottom falls out of life. That's something we must never forget. Where was God in all this? Well, I want you to look down at the end of chapter 39, where we're first told that Joseph was tossed in the pokey. And I want you to look down, verse 20. So Joseph's master took him, put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail. Now I want you to see this expression. But the Lord was with Joseph, and extended kindness to him, and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because, and here it is again, the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. Where was God in all this? Where was God when the bottom fell out? He was right there. He was with Joseph the whole time, still there in the dreariest place. God is working in his life. Now, as I said a moment ago, your life and my life, it's not really filled with Egyptian dungeons, but we have our own dungeon experiences. And we're all going to have them if we live long enough. And they come, unfair and unjust treatment comes in all different kinds of shapes. It comes in all different kinds of forms. It comes in all different kinds of sizes. But whatever form it comes in, it hurts really, really bad. And it's something that Satan can really, really exploit. And what we need to remember in those times, we don't have to say, why has God abandoned me? We need to remember that God is right there, and that God will give us the grace to deal with it and to get us through it if we'll let him. So as we look at Joseph, we see here embodied beautifully some very important principles for life. Just again, very quickly, just for your benefit, let me just summarize it very quickly. The first thing we learn as we look here at Genesis chapter 40 is we're reminded that unjust and unfair treatment sometimes comes to people who don't deserve it. It just happens. We're God's people, but we're not in heaven yet. We just need to remember that. The second thing that we're reminded of is that Joseph beautifully demonstrates how we are to respond to ill treatment. We don't let bitterness and anger fester. We respond to it with trusting God. We ask him to help us deal with the bitterness, to deal with the resentment, and to continue to serve him in a way that honors him through that. And then the last thing is we're reminded that God has never left us, that he's there in the midst of the darkest circumstances, and he is blessing us with the resources we need to deal with it. Well, we've come to the end of the lesson. It hasn't been a lesson in any way designed to tell you how to become a child of God, but we want to give that opportunity to anyone. There may be somebody here, maybe someone here who's never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ. We want to give that opportunity. If you believe that Jesus was the crucified Messiah, but you have never confessed that, surrendered your life to him in repentance and joined him in the likeness of his atoning work at the cross, in Christian baptism, being joined in the likeness of his death, being raised in the likeness of his resurrection, that can happen. My guess is, though, most people here have experienced that wonderful new birth, but there's a possibility that as we've contemplated this reality of life in a broken, fallen world, there's a possibility that maybe you've become disillusioned and that Satan has stepped in and exploited that and has taken you from that place that you need to be in your relationship with the Lord. If that's the case, I hope tonight that you will determine that you're going to get back to be what God called you to be, in the place where He wants you to be. Now, that may be something that you and the Lord just need to take care of between you and Him, right where you're sitting. And if that's the case, I hope that you'll do it. But maybe it's something you need to do in a public way. And if that's the case, I hope that you'll do that, because we would love to pray with you and pray for you. So if you have a spiritual need to take care of, why don't you do that right now while together we stand while we sing.
I hear thy welcome voice that calls me, Lord, to thee, for cleansing in thy precious blood that flowed on Calvary.
Appreciate Dan so much for his presentation tonight and your attendance. We've had a great week, and know that, again, you've been blessed. We're thankful for all of our children that are here.